I think it's slightly strange that as we start to think about our Christmas plans, our Gospel reading this Sunday is the one that leads us towards Easter. Jesus has left behind Capernaum and has made his way down to Jericho, just another day's journey before they get to Jerusalem. But here he meets a blind man, Bartimaeus. Not his real name, we don't know his name. Bartimaeus just literally means the son of Timaeus. It's a strange meeting and reflects something of what Mark's gospel was all about, the outsider being welcomed. It reflects something of the disciples' ingratitude. They had received so much from Jesus, and yet they wanted to stop others. As Bartimaeus hears that Jesus is nearby, he starts to shout. The disciples tell him to shut up. Rather like when the women brought the children to have a blessing that we read about in the earlier chapters of Mark, when the disciples wanted to send them away. It's almost like they had become so respectable, and they expected Jesus to be respectable, that they were willing to shut out those whom they thought were unacceptable to Jesus, whether it be children or a blind man. The emphasis of this passage is in the little details. It's interesting that Jesus does not say, help him, but Jesus says, call him. Call. And Jesus was all about calling people. Remember, he called the shushers, those disciples, those early fishermen from their nets, the tax collector from his booth. So why shouldn't he call others, now that they had become respectable disciples? How often in the church do we not wish Jesus to call others into the life of our church, particularly those who we would deem unacceptable, not proper? And so the disciples call him, cheer up, or take heart. And it's not you're about to see, but rather cheer up, take heart. He's calling you. Want to be happy in life? It's because Jesus calls you, not because he's going to change your life in any radical way, but because he calls you, and that is sufficient. We're told Bartimaeus threw off his cloak. We're reminded that this would have been his most precious possession. It would have kept him dry in wet weather. He would have wrapped himself in his cloak at night to keep warm. It was also effectively his begging bowl. He would have sat cross-legged at the side of the road, the cloak across his knees, and people, as they threw coins in, it would gather in the well that was made there. To throw his cloak off, especially when you are blind and you cannot see where it falls, would mean he would lose all his money and possibly the cloak itself. But for him, it was important. Nothing was going to get in his way of coming towards Jesus. Of course, it doesn't take me to remind us all of the things that sometimes we need to have cast aside if we want to come to Jesus when he calls us. It was only a couple of weeks ago that the rich young ruler came, not with a cloak or a few coins, but vast wealth. And Jesus said the same, follow me. He gave him a call, but part of that call was to cast off the things that held him back. The rich young ruler couldn't do it. Bartimaeus could. What are the things that Jesus is calling us to throw off? so that we may listen to his call, that we may follow him. And Jesus asks him, "What do you want to do for me?" Oh, isn't that obvious? He's blind. He wants to see. But Jesus asks what he really wants. He wants to go deeper into that person's life, into Bartimaeus' life, and sometimes he wants to go deeper into our life. We sometimes think about what we want Jesus to do for us. And sometimes we ask in prayer, but the answer we get from Jesus is, "But what do you really want me to do for you?" Jesus has healed blind men in the past. A person who'd perhaps lost his sight through illness, back in Mark chapter 8, whose first words were, "I see people, and they look like trees walking about." What was the first thing that Bartimaeus saw, who'd been blind from birth, who would not know what a tree or a human looked like? The first thing he saw would be the face of Jesus, who hadn't shushed him, who hadn't simply dropped a few coins in his cloak, but had asked him what he really wants. As a church, are we a church who just want people to be quiet, not to cause a fuss? Or are we a church which will throw a few coins at a problem, but without asking what is really needed here? We are challenged by the presence of Jesus. When we want to push the difficulty to one side, when we tell the problematic people to shush, be quiet, don't disturb the church, don't rock the boat, it is Jesus who says, call him, call her, call that person into your fellowship now. And of course, when Bartimaeus is called, he is called to follow. But it's a challenge. Bartimaeus does not go home. He doesn't throw a party. He doesn't try and find a job. He followed Jesus along the road. He was called before and after he was healed. Before he was called to say what he really, really needed. He was called to allow Jesus to look deep into his soul. Afterwards, he was called not to go and find another life, but to follow the life of Jesus. And that was going to be challenging, because what was happening was that Jesus was going from Jericho up to Jerusalem, there to be tried and executed. Maybe Bartimaeus was one of those in the crowd who followed Jesus on Palm Sunday up into the city. Maybe he was one in the crowd who was horrified when they started shouting, "Crucify him," as the bruised and broken Jesus appeared in the praetorium. Maybe he was one who witnessed the crucifixion and the storm. And hopefully he was the one who was in the upper room when Jesus rose again triumphant. Sometimes when Jesus calls us, he calls us to follow that road from Jericho to Jerusalem. Not an easy road, not an easy path, but he calls us still the same. Are we willing to follow? Are we willing to cast off the cloak, get rid of all the things that entrap us and hold us back from the call of Jesus? Are we willing to follow him, not to the cosy stable of Christmas, but to the cross on Golgotha? Are we willing to stare upon the one who was crucified, the one who has loved, healed and called us? I pray to God that we might be a people who listen to God's call, to listen to the call of Jesus and to follow him, no matter which road he calls us to take. We thank God for the call of Bartimaeus and the call upon our lives. May we follow Jesus wherever he may lead us. Amen.